I wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on and recognise any other people or families with connection to the lands of the ACT and region. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are listening today. Welcome to another episode of Safety Spotlight. My name's Lish Fayer, and in this episode we're going to tackle asbestos, silica and dangerous substances. Thousands of Australians continue to be exposed to silica and asbestos at work each year, often without immediate symptoms but with serious long-term health consequences. Asbestos remains present in millions of buildings and infrastructure assets despite a national ban since 2003. Similarly, exposure to respirable crystalline silica continues across construction, manufacturing, mining. So many industries are impacted. Now, the long latency of this disease means harm occurring today might not be visible for decades. And these national strategic plans recognise that prevention now is critical to protecting future generations of workers. So a really important topic. And joining us today, we have Kate Cole, OAM. She's an occupational hygienist, engineer. She specialises in the prevention of dust diseases and airborne hazards. A Winston Churchill Fellow who's been working in this industry for decades. Importantly for this discussion, she sits on the Asbestos and Silica Safety Eradication Council. Good morning to you, Kate.
Oh, good morning, and thanks so much for having me.
Also joining us in the room today is Jackie Aegis, Work Health and Safety Commissioner here with WorkSafe ACT. Good morning, Jackie.
Good morning, Lish. Great to be with you again. And Kate, thanks so much for joining us for this important discussion.
You're very welcome.
Let's start, Kate, with you. First of all, what are we talking about? Crystalline silica and asbestos. You say it's almost everywhere. You could dig up a bit of soil and find it. What is it?
So crystalline silica, we're talking about silicon dioxide. It's one of the most abundant minerals in the world. You'll know crystalline silica because you've gone to the beach and you've sat on the sand, and that sand is crystalline silica. But that doesn't mean that you're going to contract silica-related diseases just from going to the beach. We're really concerned about crystalline silica when it's ground up into a really, really fine dust or a powder, or we cut into something that contains crystalline silica, because then we're worried about something that's called respirable crystalline silica, which we commonly call silica dust. And it's the really small particle size, in addition to it containing crystalline silica, that is the problem. And so we will find crystalline silica in products like concrete and brick and tile and grout, and indeed sandstone, shale, other stones and rocks. And when they're in their solid state as stone, they don't pose any risk to health. That's not the problem. The problem is when we get a power tool and we apply it to that stone, now we're generating really, really fine dust, and that dust is silica dust. And when we breathe in silica dust, over time, it's associated with an increased risk of many diseases, including the occupational lung disease, silicosis, lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and in fact, many, many other diseases that are all completely preventable, but sadly incurable, and can lead to a very shortened lifespan, and in many cases have led to death in workers who have been working with crystalline silica and silica dust during their working careers.
Is it an amount of crystalline silica dust that's inhaled that is the problem, or can one exposure change the fate?
Well, the risk of silica-related diseases like silicosis increases with what we call cumulative exposure, or exposure over time. So the higher the level of exposure, the higher the risk of disease. So we're generally talking about repeated exposure over time And that's what we've seen in workers recently that have been diagnosed with silica-related diseases like silicosis in engineered stone. Workers may have worked, 10 or 15 years, but in some cases have only worked a few years in that industry and sadly developed, silicosis. We've also seen this in other industries such as tunnelling, construction, building, mining. Actually, the span of industries where silica-related diseases are present is quite broad, and that's really related to the ubiquitous nature of crystalline silica in a lot of the products and materials that are used in workplaces across the country.
Yeah, so alarming. Why do silica and asbestos continue to be two of the biggest contributors to work-related diseases and deaths in Australia, despite decades of awareness?
Well, I think it's a really good question. And the short answer is that awareness alone doesn't prevent exposure. So awareness is necessary, absolutely, but taking action on that awareness to prevent exposure is really what prevents work-related disease and death. So I think with asbestos, the challenge is legacy materials. Although asbestos was banned in Australia in 2003, there's still an estimated 6 million tonnes of asbestos-containing materials in our built infrastructure, homes, schools, hospitals and the like. And as these materials age and deteriorate, the risk of fibre release increases. And I think importantly, most Australians know that asbestos is dangerous. Recent research from the Asbestos and Silica Safety and Eradication Agency found that more than 90% of people recognise it's dangerous, but awareness doesn't always translate into safe action. We have many do-it-yourself renovators that don't always know how to identify asbestos or what to do if they find it. Some might believe it's safe to leave it in place indefinitely if it appears to be in good condition, but the reality is that a lot of our asbestos is over 40 years old and it is deteriorating. So the challenge is no longer just awareness, it's about improving understanding of how to identify it and moving to safe, proactive removal where practicable. But silica is just slightly different. Despite the risks of silica dust being known for more than a century, public awareness is still relatively low compared to asbestos, even though silica is far more common in modern construction materials like concrete and brick and stone, for example, and any cutting or creating a dust from those materials will generate silica dust. And like asbestos, these silica-related diseases develop years after exposure, meaning workers may not realise harm until much later. So I would argue that we have some more work to do with awareness of silica dust, but it's not just awareness. There's still a bit of a gap there.
Jackie, what are you seeing in the ACT?
Yeah, so from a regulatory perspective, I'd like to pick up on something that Kate said about identifying. And one of the things our inspectors fail to see is tradespeople properly identifying these products in workplaces. And they should know by now, as Kate said, awareness is pretty high, particularly when it comes to asbestos. And in the ACT, we have mandatory asbestos awareness training. We're the only jurisdiction that has that training to pick up that awareness responsibility. I can give you an example. Last year we had a matter before the court where a tradesperson was convicted of failing to identify and properly manage asbestos. And what they did is they removed some asbestos roof sheeting from a shed. They carried it out through this person's property. They put it in a trailer out the front. They left it there for a little bit. Then they came along, transferred it to another trailer without using any PPE, without using any isolation, without properly wrapping or disposing this product. And in the end, WorkSafe had to go in. We organised the safe disposal of the product because it was sitting in a residential area, not properly wrapped in a trailer. And so Kate mentioned that we see individual tradespeople out there not doing the right thing, and that's certainly something that we see as the regulator.
You say there's this awareness there, but then the training and recognition and how to deal with it. Clearly in the ACT, if things like that are happening, what is the block, say, with asbestos in dealing with it? Is it a she'll be right, what are the chances, costs, what's going on there?
Look, I think it's all of those things. People want to cut costs, people want to save time. Often to identify these products, you need to take a sample, take it to a lab to get it properly identified. What we want to see in the ACT is people assuming that any product in the built environment that could be asbestos is treated as asbestos, and that you take all necessary measures to ensure that you're dealing with that product safely. I think we're going to have a little bit more challenge in the future when it comes to the identification of silica products, particularly in the engineered stone space. So engineered stone was banned in Australia in 2024. What we are seeing are a lot of products that look like engineered stone but don't have the silica content that engineered stone has. And so the legacy issues for that going forward, I think, are going to be challenging for everybody, both the workers, the managers, the companies that deal in this space, as well as the regulatory agencies.
What Jackie just said, Kate, is that reflected nationally?
Yes, I think generally we see the same types of practices across the country. You know, these hazards don't stop at jurisdictional borders. And, you know, the recent asbestos awareness survey undertaken by ASEA was national. And so I understand we're seeing largely the same patterns across Australia. And I think that really emphasises why we have such value or hold such value in these national strategic plans for both asbestos and silica, because they create a consistent national direction aligning really important things like policy and regulation, prevention initiatives, awareness raising activities and long-term action across Australia, rather than just looking at particular issues on a jurisdictional state or territory basis. Even though each one of those is important, this is a national problem. And so we need to look at these things from a national perspective.
Do you think, in your perspective, are all silica and asbestos-related diseases preventable? Can we change this?
Do you want to fight about answering this question, Kate? Because I'm sure we both have exactly the same response.
Well, absolutely. These diseases are completely preventable because both silica and asbestos-related diseases are caused by exposure. So no exposure means no disease. They are not diseases of fate. They are diseases of exposure, and this is completely preventable. Are we disagreeing, Jackie?
Absolutely not. I knew we wouldn't, Kate. And if we look at the figures of work-related disease in this country, I think it will astound some people. Currently, we have about 4,000 people diagnosed in Australia a year with asbestos-related illnesses, and just over 75% of those are related to work. Astounding.
That's
that
extraordinary number.
Asbestos causes the most lung-related diseases of any dangerous product.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you add to that the recent estimates of cases of silicosis and lung cancer due to silica exposure based on recent exposures, and those numbers were in around 100,000 cases of silicosis and 10,000 cases of lung cancer due to exposures, which was benchmark a few years ago. And understanding that that disease may not appear for decades, that damage is already done. These two substances cause a significant burden of disease in Australia, and that's why we need to focus our efforts on eliminating exposure to both asbestos and silica wherever possible.
Those figures on silica came from the Curtin University study in 2016 of the predicted cases of silicosis if exposure remained at those same levels. And so this is part of the reason for the push to ensure that we stop exposure to these dangerous substances.
So we knew about it in 2016 from things like this. The legislation came in for silicosis or silica, managing silica risks in 2024. There's going to be a huge lag time in this. Do you anticipate that it'll get a lot worse before it gets better?
Well, certainly, because as an occupational hygienist that's worked in many industries, the way that silica has been managed historically has not been sufficient or adequate in many areas. I think that's pretty fair to say. And so there has been a significant number of workers in Australia who have already been exposed to silica dust. And we know that that disease can take decades to manifest. Although having said that, recent research from Monash University has demonstrated that the average age of those being diagnosed with silica-related diseases is actually getting younger, which is not a great outcome, because it can mean that workers are exposed much earlier. It can also mean that workers are exposed to much greater concentrations than they have been previously. So yes, arguably we will continue to see quite a number of these diseases be diagnosed in Australia. But, to Jackie's point, this is why it's so important to shift from, this idea of quote unquote managing exposure to the idea of eliminating exposure, because eliminating exposure eliminates the disease.
Dust has this perception. Dust, it's all around us. You can't see it a lot of the time. People just say that it's part of society, part of your workplace. Dust seems so benign in so many ways, but so deadly in this sort of work. How do you get to eliminating it?
Oh, there are some wonderful ways to eliminate. There's a vast variety of tools entering the market, and those tools include things like wet saws. We've seen things like grinders that have dust extractions on them. Recently, I've seen HEPA vacuums for wet and dry. And of course, you can't just use a normal domestic vacuum when you're vacuuming up this type of dust. And you should always use a vacuum, not sweep. So we're seeing some wonderful technology in this space. But of course, respirators that are properly fitted, not just your little masks where you pinch your nose and people go off and do their work. I'm sure Kate has lots of examples additional to that on elimination as an occupational hygienist.
What's best practice, Kate?
Best practice is really good planning to eliminate the need to generate a dust. So I'm a practical person. I understand that we can't always eliminate crystalline silica from all of our building materials, like bricks and like mortar or like cement or concrete-based materials. I understand that crystalline silica in those materials is there for many purposes in terms of strength and other types of criteria. So we can't always eliminate it. But often we can eliminate the need to generate a dust from those products. And that comes down to things like, well, what about precast concrete? We've actually designed trenches or cutouts ahead of time to prevent tradies going in later to chase out things for electrical cables. Why can't we plan and design that already in place? And in some cases, we can substitute crystalline silica for less toxic alternatives such as amorphous silica and other products. And I'm talking about specific types of silica-free grout. The replacement of crystalline silica in engineered stone is a great example of a substitution. And then when we start looking at engineering controls, as Jackie referred to, the use of wet cutting or on-tool dust suppression or extraction, there has never been a better time for tradies than 2026, with the vast variety of products that are now on the market available to tradies to be able to take those steps and get this these types of products from hardware stores pretty easily. Tool manufacturers have really come on board. So we have integrated systems. So no longer should we ever see a situation where we have a worker cutting tiles or concrete with a saw and another worker standing next to them with a garden hose. Like, that's just not on. We have integrated machinery and equipment now that really does minimize the generation of this toxic dust. And that's really where our focus needs to be, because I think another important point that's often missed is that what's changing over time, in addition to us having many more types of products at our disposal to help safely manage this risk, what's also changing over time is our knowledge of the toxicity of silica dust. So we are seeing disease develop at levels previously thought to have been quote unquote safe. And while we have these legal limits in legislation, workplace exposure standards or limits, whatever you want to call them at any point in time, we should never assume that these standards or limits always prevent disease. So the more time that goes on and the more studies that are published, it just reinforces why we need to focus our efforts on planning, on having really good controls in place, and minimising the need to equip workers with respiratory protection and dust masks. So we've already done that planning ahead of time, and we've prevented the need to even generate that dust to start with.
And what Kate's talking about is safety by design. And we should always aim for that in every area of safety for whatever we do. And if we want to eliminate, safety by design is absolutely the key.
What are the barriers to that, though? You've already pointed out some cost things and time pressures, the perception that it's a little bit,
Well, you're asking me as the regulator what the barriers are to safety by design, and I say there's no excuse.
Yeah, from my perspective, the biggest barrier is awareness, because it can't be cost. It is so much cheaper to design out the hazard. It is so much cheaper to address it at time of design and planning than it is to deal with the need to have multiple engineering controls, respiratory protection programs, fit testing, training, crystalline silica accredited training, air monitoring, health monitoring. I'd love to see the argument that all of that is cheaper than
workers'
just dealing with it
compensation
at time of
costs.
design.
What industries are the highest risk of these sort of respirable crystalline silica exposure, and how is that risk changing as work practices and materials evolve? Have you got any great case study examples?
Well, the biggest industry and where we see the most cases are from workers who've worked in the construction industry. But when we think about the construction industry as a whole, we need to look at everybody that comes into contact with a construction site. So we're talking about, as well as your trades workers, we're talking about your administrative workers, we're talking about your cleaners. There's a vast variety of people who come into contact with construction sites.
So it's not just the person on the tools cutting
Not
the
just
stone
the person
bench
on the
top,
tools.
or it's every single person.
I would completely agree. Construction, in terms of the level of exposure and the sheer size of the construction industry, is a key contributor, unfortunately, to the burden of disease that we see for both asbestos and silica. And I guess what Jackie's referring to is that what we would call in occupational hygiene secondary exposure. So you have workers that are primarily exposed because they're using heavy equipment that might be on an excavator, or they're using a hand tool to generate dust. But then you also see exposure through secondary means. So someone gets a broom out and starts cleaning, and that dust gets into the air, and that dust contains respirable crystalline silica, and that's how they're exposed. Or it might be scaffolders that come in afterwards to take down that scaffolding, and that scaffolding is covered in silica dust, and they're being exposed just from dismantling a scaffold, even though they haven't been the ones that have personally generated that dust. There's all these ways that secondary exposure can impact workers in the construction industry. And so it's a huge problem, and it just brings it back to the importance of focusing on controlling that dust at the start. So good planning, capturing it in place, because once it's out in the broader construction and building environment, then we're dealing with this hazard at scale, and it can affect a lot of workers.
Extraordinary to hear the extent of it. How do the Silica National Strategic Plan 2024 to 2030 and the Asbestos National Strategic Plan 2024 to 2030 create a nationally coordinated approach to preventing exposure and eliminating disease, all of these diseases that you have studied, Kate, for so long?
Well, both the Asbestos and the Silica National Strategic Plans are endorsed by the Commonwealth and the state and territory governments. And I think that to start with, that commitment is important and it's significant because these hazards don't stop at jurisdictional borders, as I mentioned. And so inconsistent approaches can create gaps in protection, and that's not what we want. So both of these plans are built essentially around three shared goals. The first is eliminating disease. The second is supporting people affected by disease. And thirdly, positioning us, Australia, as an international leader in prevention and management. And importantly, these aren't, aspirational documents. They do contain specific actions and priorities for government, regulators, industry, responsible for many items within that plan. But reflecting on asbestos, so we're in phase 3 of the plan. The current plan represents a really, really important shift. So earlier phases focused heavily on awareness and risk management, but phase 3 recognises our ageing asbestos legacy and that it requires more proactive removal. We have 6 million tonnes of asbestos-containing materials in our built environment, so just managing it is probably not enough because these materials deteriorate. So it's around sort of shifting that conversation and the priority to proactive removal. And for Silica, this is our first nationally coordinated framework, so it's a bit historic. And, it was developed with extensive consultation over a long period of time and has a number of really important actions, firstly starting with prevention. But back to our previous conversation, they also make really good, strong economic cases for prevention. So there's been modelling that has been done that suggests that full implementation of the asbestos strategy could see asbestos progressively removed from Australian buildings by 2068, preventing up to, I think it's around 27,000 asbestos-related deaths and delivering an estimated economic return of around, I think it's $2 for every dollar invested. So it doesn't just make good ethical and moral sense, it makes good economic sense as well. But overall, look, the value of these plans is that they provide a consistent national direction, they align us on policy, regulation, prevention and awareness, and ultimately long-term action across Australia. So they're incredibly important.
And I also sit on the implementation committee for ASEA, the Senior Implementation Committee. And these plans have 3 aims. Aim 1 is to eliminate asbestos-related diseases in Australia or silica-related diseases in Australia. Aim 2 is to support others and workers who are affected by these diseases. And Aim 3 is to be an international leader. Aim 3, of course, is an important one because we see products coming into Australia that may have asbestos-containing materials or silica-containing materials that are not properly labelled. And so we want to ensure that part of the work that we're doing through ASEA is making other countries around the world aware of how dangerous these products are.
This national plan and this shared commitment from governments, regulators, industry, unions, it's a huge push to make these workplaces safe. So many of our podcasts that we discuss, like the barriers to it, and so often it just comes down to the human element. Do you see that it's the human element that's causing a lot of the risks?
Look, that's absolutely part of it. And we know with safety, people need to commit to safety and employers need to commit to safety. And just as an example, we're a small jurisdiction. We currently have 5 matters before the court where WorkSafe are alleging there were breaches in relation to asbestos management in workplaces. That's enormous. 5 cases in the ACT that are currently progressing through the court. Commitment's a big one. There's also that view that because the risk isn't seen immediately because of the long latency in some of these diseases, there's that attitude of everything will be all right. This isn't going to get me. But we see that in relation to risks all throughout the community, not just in safety.
I completely agree. The other thing I see that you alluded to before was this idea of a cost barrier. Oh, it's going to cost more for us to do it the right way. It's just going to be 5 minutes. Let's just do it this way. And I think it discounts the whole idea that it's much more expensive in the long run to take these shortcuts. It's much more cost effective to do the right thing, to focus on controlling exposure, identifying the hazard, controlling exposure, keeping workers safe from both exposure to asbestos and silica, absolutely. And part of it also is it's a shared responsibility. Yes, it's about making sure that the safety controls are implemented, and that might be wet cutting or the use of respiratory protection at the worker level. But from my perspective, a bigger part is having those types of safety controls made available, and that sits on, our PCBs, our employers. And sometimes that is absent. And that, I think, comes from a misunderstanding of the nature of the hazard. So not identifying that asbestos is present, or not identifying that crystalline silica is present, and then not understanding just how big of a risk these two substances can pose to the health of workers. I think there's a big misunderstanding there. These are highly toxic substances. Both asbestos fibres and crystalline silica particles are completely invisible to the naked eye. Often we equate risk with seeing dust clouds. That's not what it's like. These are invisible particles. We can't see them, we can't taste them, we can't smell them. So it's about identifying the hazard, and if that hazard is there and we're generating any type of dust, then please understand that risk is there. And so that's why we really need to focus on controlling that dust and preventing it from being breathed in by our workforce.
And we need to remember that asbestos was only banned in Australia on the 31st of December 2003. That's actually not that long ago. We should be assuming that any building built prior to 2004 could have asbestos in it, and managing any work that we're doing in those buildings as though they do have asbestos in them.
So, Kate, thousands of Australians still being exposed to silica and asbestos at work each year, often without knowing it. Might be workers, might be DIY enthusiasts, might be someone today just pulling out a bathroom window with a bit of asbestos above it, who knows. Why does exposure seem so hard to detect and control in real-world workplaces and DIY jobs?
Well, I guess the reality is it's not that hard. It's just equipping people with the knowledge of how to do it. There are some great resources available, even on the WorkSafe ACT website, on the Asbestos and Silica Safety and Eradication Agency website, about resources that can equip you with information on who to go to help you identify asbestos in the built environment, or help you identify crystalline silica in the products that you're using. I guess one of the challenges that I alluded to before is that we're talking about dust and fibres that are invisible and you can't see them. And secondly, exposure to these hazards can be highly intermittent. So a worker might cut concrete for 15 or 20 minutes in a particular day and think, that's not a lot. But during that very short period, they can be exposed to very high concentrations of crystalline silica. And over time, that builds up and that increases the risk of developing silica-related disease, which may not manifest for, a decade or two later. And, maybe that connection has not been made. But that's why I like to bring it back to the importance of hazard identification. So start there, which, for asbestos, you can engage an occupational hygienist to help you identify it. For silica, you can do the same, but you can also, do things like read the labels on the products that you're bringing into your work site. You can read the safety data sheet. You can reach out to the manufacturer if those things are absent and ask them what is there. You can treat all natural ground as if it contains crystalline silica, because most of it does, unless you test it to demonstrate that it's absent of that, but that's actually quite rare. And you'll find that crystalline silica is in many, many products and materials used in the construction and building industry. And you might be surprised at just how many materials that are being used that contain it. The science of prevention is well understood. The challenge is awareness and the hazard, identifying that particular hazard, getting the controls in place and making those controls work consistently in the real world. When it comes to asbestos, we know that it was banned in 2003, but before that, it was often used in many building products because of its properties that made it so desirable. It was very cheap, it was fire retardant, it had good properties for building materials, and we find it in a plethora of materials in the built environment, from floor tiles to insulation to roofing material to fencing material. The list is actually quite broad. There's a really good guide on the Asbestos and Silica Safety and Eradication website that will help you identify or be aware of asbestos-containing materials in the built environment. But I think it's important to understand that this product was used extensively in Australia. And so when we're doing things like demolition or renovation of properties of the built environment, and those properties are built before 2004, like Jackie mentioned, it's incumbent on us to just assume that a lot of those products will contain asbestos, and it's really important that we get a professional out to identify which particular products contain asbestos and what is their quality or how are they actually holding up. Because a lot of this asbestos is over 40 years old, it is deteriorating, and with that deterioration comes an increased risk of fibre release. And the best time to remove asbestos is now. But of course, we can't remove all of it at the same time. We need to look at the highest risks type of products, and that will be the ones that are, maybe most accessible, or the ones that are deteriorating the most or have the highest risk of fibre release. And we've seen this across the country with, councils that have done some really good work in identifying and prioritising the removal of asbestos-containing materials. And indeed, with the property market the way it is, there's a lot of DIYers out there updating their properties, going into older properties and making it their home. There is a lot of opportunity to identify asbestos-containing materials in that context and take the appropriate steps to proactively remove it from our built environment, because the risk of exposure to asbestos fibres is not something that we should be dealing with in the decades to come. We really need to be proactive about removing it within our environment.
And contrary to what silica exposure is cumulative, asbestos is not?
So similar to asbestos, the risk of developing asbestos-related disease increases with exposure to asbestos fibres, and asbestos is associated with diseases such as mesothelioma, devastating lung disease, in addition to asbestosis, and indeed many other asbestos-related diseases. So this does have a very large burden on our communities, not just those that are diagnosed themselves, but their friends, their families, the wider community, and indeed our public health system, where these cases of asbestos and silica-related diseases are being treated and are being cared for. Thankfully, we do have some really wonderful support organisations within Australia for workers that have been diagnosed with dust diseases. And these support organisations do absolutely fabulous work with connecting those that have been diagnosed with really important support services, and just being there at the end of the line to provide really important advice and support for the many workers in this situation.
Jackie, I do want to ask you though, with the lag time, support is one thing, but is there compensation for workers who get diagnosed with a dust disease decades after exposure?
So in the ACT, we have the default insurance fund, and that fund will pick up workers' compensation for workers who are diagnosed with a work-related illness that aren't currently covered by a workers' compensation policy. So, but I can't speak to other jurisdictions. The difficulty, of course, with both of these diseases is tracking where the illness came from.
How do we do that, Kate?
I'm often engaged as an expert witness in cases where workers with a diagnosed dust lung disease have sought compensation from their former employers. And so I'm acutely aware of some of the challenges that are involved about trying to understand where this exposure has come from. But I will say that generally when you have workers working with particular products that contain asbestos or contain silica, and then they explain the types of work that they have undertaken, it becomes a bit more clear in those types of situations. Equally, when workers are going through that process of trying to, I guess, understand maybe if some of the symptoms they may be experiencing do equate to a particular diagnosed or dust disease, then the treating doctor will spend a lot of time going through the worker's occupational history and trying to understand the types of jobs that they have done and the types of materials that they have worked with. And then on that basis, that helps inform, in part, the particular diagnosis of that disease. And in my experience, those that have been diagnosed with a silica-related disease, I think it might be surprising, haven't just worked across one industry. They've worked across several. So it may not just be engineered stone, which may be a bit cut and dry, pardon the pun. It may be across construction and building. It may be across manufacturing. It may be, even in landscaping and ceramics. Sadly, the opportunity to be exposed to respirable crystalline silica or silica dust is quite large. And that's why we see so many cases of dust diseases relating to silica across so many industries, across so many occupations, across so many jobs. So it can be complex, but it all starts with identifying the hazard and where that may have been to start with.
And it just makes me think, Posby, that the strategy that was introduced in 2024 to eliminate it, how long did you fight to get it eliminated since we knew the risks?
Well, I think we took a lot of lessons from asbestos. So the biggest lesson, I think, is that waiting too long costs lives. And with asbestos, industry self-regulation failed. We had action that lagged behind the evidence. By the time we as a country banned asbestos, hundreds of thousands of workers had already been exposed. And if you look at the case of engineered stone and the associated ban, we definitely moved faster. And I think that's because we had learnt our lesson in part from asbestos. There does remain a question as to whether we moved fast enough, but we were the first in the world to ban engineered stone, and that's okay, that's important. That was a bold move, but it was an important move because we needed to stop exposure to this incredibly toxic product because there were just a significant number of cases coming out from workers that had been working with this product, which was arguably higher risk than any other type of stone that they had worked with before. So I think we've learnt a lot, and I think we've learnt it's okay to take the big, bold steps and to be the first in the world to do something like that.
It feels a bit like the plastic bag ban, though. You can ban one thing, but then there are so many other ways of contracting silicosis in products and in industry and in construction. It's great to highlight, but there's so much more to raise.
And that's why we need to implement the highest control, which is elimination.
I think an important nuance that is often missed, because sometimes people will reduce this issue of the ban on engineered stone to somewhat of a false dichotomy and say things like, but we shouldn't have banned engineered stone because we can't ban crystalline silica in concrete. They try to create this false dichotomy, which is completely ridiculous. We banned engineered stone because the prevalence of disease in workers that were working with engineered stone was so high. In one jurisdiction, I think it was Queensland, it was 1 in every 4 workers. That we didn't have any industry where 1 in every 4 workers had a diagnosed disease relevant to silica, so silica-related disease. So that prevalence was ridiculously high. And so we banned the most toxic product. So that's not to say that we don't have an issue more broadly with silica in other industries, but it meant that we focused our elimination efforts exactly where they needed to be, and that was at the highest risk. But it also means we don't just ignore all the other industries. That's why it was so important that the crystalline silica regulations were brought in. That's why it was important that we have the code of practice that has come in, that we have appropriately resourced regulators to provide education, advice and enforcement where necessary on those regulations, and the importance of the national plan. So I think, having a broader understanding of the environment is important, and understanding maybe why one decision is appropriate in one area and another, policy perspective or approach is more effective in another is important.
Kate, you've been absolutely fantastic in highlighting all of the issues that are facing Australia at the moment. I wonder if there's any final thoughts from you and Jackie as well?
Look, I think there's genuine reasons for us to be optimistic. So in the past few years, we have introduced, new strategic plans. We've implemented a world-first engineered stone ban. We've strengthened disease notification systems. We've shifted the asbestos conversation towards proactive removal. We've introduced new crystalline silica regulations. These represent real movement in occupational health policy, and so that is optimistic. But the work is not finished. We still see thousands of deaths each year linked to these products of asbestos and silica. We're now seeing younger workers diagnosed with silicosis. But we know what effective prevention looks like. We just need to make sure that those controls are implemented consistently across every workplace, not just on paper, but in practice as well.
I love your optimism, Kate, because it's important that we remain optimistic. Yes, there is more work to do. Prevention is our strongest protection. My last thoughts are act now, continue to act, and act always.
Anywhere people can find more information, if this has highlighted anything, whether they are in the industry or know people in the industry?
If you're listening to this podcast and you want more information, in addition to your state regulator, I encourage you to go to asbestosafety.gov.au, because that's the website of the Asbestos and Silica Safety Eradication Agency. And from that point, you will find links to a whole bunch of really useful and helpful information and contacts.
We've got so much going on, still so much to do. But Kate, it's fantastic that you are leading this charge. It is clear from this conversation that silica and asbestos-related diseases are not inevitable. They're the result of exposure. Exposure is preventable. While the harm caused by these hazards can take decades to surface, the choice we make today will shape the health and safety of future generation of workers. But I think also not just workers. It's the enthusiast at home who's maybe a bit too enthusiastic. And as you pointed out, so many tools available at the hardware shop that people can go and do a lot at home themselves, and perhaps need to be much more aware of the risks as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Kate and Jackie. Really appreciate all the expertise you add to these conversations, because I certainly add none. I add questions. And thanks for listening to the Safety Spotlight. If someone needs to hear this conversation, please forward it on to them and subscribe. Thanks for joining us.